Yeah, thanks a lot, Clara, for the invitation. So last time it was Lufthansa's fault because they decided to cancel all the flights. So this time I booked it through SAS just to be sure I was here. So as mentioned, I mean, it depends on, I mean, if you talk to the physicists, I mean, usually physicists are really skeptical about the word machine learning because, I mean, the associated machine learning is something like with the black box magic or something you don't understand. So that's why originally I had actually entitled this talk Digital Signal Processing Techniques for Noise Characterization of Frequency Cones. But then we see that this year's Nobel Prize in Physics was actually given to John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton. And it was Physics Nobel Prize given to the, to foundational discoveries and inventions within machine learning. So I was thinking, okay, maybe it's fine we call it machine learning for characterization of frequency cones. Because I think, physicists should get more and more used to it. That actually, I mean, the field of machine learning can bring significant advantages. And the way I see it, I mean, is a little bit like, with running numerical simulations. I think, the field of machine learning will bring us some new tools and actually that we can use to solve within the fields of physics or engineering. So I think definitely I can recommend studying machine learning or even, having specialized courses on how, for example, to use machine learning in physics or on communication engineering or something like this. So a little bit about what we are working in my group. So we are called Machine Learning in Photonics Group. And basically we have different topics. And the common denominator for all these topics is actually how to apply machine learning to advanced photonic systems. And one of them is actually inverse design of ultra-broadband Raman amplifiers. I mean, I don't have time to go into all the topics, but the basic idea is here is some kind of inverse system design that you say, well, I would like to design an amplifier with these properties. How do I actually adjust my input parameters such that I obtain such a behavior? And the second one, which I will cover today and go into the more detail, is how to use machine learning for characterization of frequency combs. And then we also have, our topic that we use machine learning for communication over complex channels, because if you want to send the data through the, for example, linear channels, where we don't have any nonlinearities, then we know, from theory, what are the optimal solutions. But if you, for example, would like to send the data through a nonlinear fiber optic channel or for a multimode fiber channel, then actually we don't have analytical solutions, for the optimal signaling schemes. And this is actually where machine learning comes into play. And then we have a third topic, that we are working on optical technologies to accelerate the AI or neuromorphic computing. And recently we started working on machine learning enabled fiber-based sensing system. And this fiber-based sensing system is becoming more and more popular because you have more and more fibers being installed, and this fiber is not just being installed under ocean, it's also being installed everywhere in the building, under the road, and so on. So people would like to use this installed fiber infrastructure for sensing. And because, the refractive index of fiber is sensitive to temperature and vibrations, then you can actually do a lot of cool sensing, having this huge amount of data that you collect from this already installed fiber infrastructure. And this is something that we started working on. So we don't have so much results, but there is, a lot of activities, at least in the European Union, on this machine learning enabled fiber-based sensing systems. Okay. But before I go into the topic, I think I would like to explain a little bit, where does the machine learning excel? Because every time we have these new topics, people get overhyped and overexcited, and you spend a lot of time on this, and then you say, well, what kind of problems can we use machine learning to solve? And one of the problems is that where we can use machine learning is actually to learn these complex mappings. Because if we have, for example, a system here, which is described by function f, and then we have some inputs to the system in x, and then outputs y, and then if this is very, very complicated, then we can actually use machine learning to build a model that relates x and y. And then instead of, for example, trying to solve this complex system, then we can actually just run this machine learning algorithm, which is going to give us solution much more faster. Or we can actually use it to find this inverse mapping, or for inverse system design. Basically, in this case, we are given a target output, and what we would like to do is actually we would like to determine the inverse function, or we would like to determine the parameters given the inverse function that will give us this specific output. And this is something that characterizes inverse system learning, that you start with a specific objective, and then you look for the parameters that will actually result in this specific objective or the specific goal. And finally, where machine learning really excels is actually to learn the decision rules. Basically, given an input x to our system, which is described here, or f, then we would like to determine what is the probability of our output being either 1 or 0. And what we can actually do is actually we can use neural networks actually, or to build this relationship, I mean, to learn these functional mappings here. And the reason why we use neural networks is because they are, I mean, universal functional approximators, and they're also very flexible models. That means that they're parameterized with many parameters that we can actually learn and adapt to the data. Okay, so potentially when we look at the photonics, I mean, then we would like to ask ourselves, so what kind of benefit will we have from machine learning? Well, I mean, there are different things that where we can use machine learning. One of them, if you look at the communication of our nonlinear fiber optic channel, then I mean, the channel, I mean, the fiber optic channel is described by nonlinear Schrödinger equation. So that's why, I mean, for this type of a nonlinear system, I mean, first of all, the capacity of this channel is unknown. So we don't know the information theoretic limit, how much data we can actually transmit through the fiber. And this is still an open question. And then the optimum receiver architecture or the optimum modulation of pulse shapes are unknown. Because, I mean, it's very hard to derive them from the first principles. I mean, because, I mean, the propagation of the signal to the fiber is governed by the nonlinear Schrödinger equation. So getting this analytical expression or the result is very difficult. And this is where we can restrain actually to machine learning. And then for the design of optical amplifiers, for example, for a multi-band systems, I mean, because in this case, I mean, we would like to design the very broadband amplifiers. And what we have very complex relationship between, for example, the pumps and the gain of the amplifier. Especially, for example, if it's like a Raman amplifier when you need to have like a multi-pumps where you need to optimize both the power of the pumps and the wavelength. And I mean, for example, for a target gain profile, this becomes a very difficult optimization problem. And especially if you have many modes, I mean, then you need to take into account this also mode dependency. So in general, it becomes a very difficult problem. And this is actually where this type of very complex optimizations can be effectively solved by using the tools from machine learning toolbox. And then also for the design of optical components, for example, and this is called inverse system design. So given a laser bandwidth and the noise figure, find the physical parameters that will result in such a component. I mean. And also another option is actually instead of running time-consuming simulations, you can build fast data-driven ML models that you can actually run very fast to get some first outputs or the results. But the focus of today's talk, I mean, is going to be about the noise characterization of lasers and frequency combs. And what we can actually do there using some of the tools from the signal processing and machine learning is actually to do this phase noise or noise source separation. Because when you design, for example, a frequency comb, there will be many noise sources interacting. And what we like to do is actually to do some kind of a blind source separation to separate those noise sources. And then again, I mean, what you can do, I mean, you can actually, once you separate the noise sources, you can build these noise correlation matrices. You can build amplitude to amplitude correlation matrix or phase to phase or amplitude phase. And then from these correlation matrices, because you have multiple lines, you can learn some very interesting physics. And then at the end of the day, we would also like to see, I mean, how can we actually reach this quantum noise limited phase estimation? Because actually that's the best what we can do, I mean, where we're just limited by the quantum noise. And this requires, for example, for a dual cone spectroscopy that you try to find the match filtering in order to suppress the noise from the surroundings. Okay, so going a little bit further ahead, I mean, so what does it mean to recover signals from a noisy measurement? So typically, if this is our system, I mean, this is our measurement system described by a function f, then we have some input signal to our system, which is like, let's say, I mean, this is like a time series. And then g of t is a mapping function, and this is just to show you that, okay, this is a maps. I mean, it's a kind of a stochastic process here that has the evolution of this type of a signal. And then every time you do a measurement, basically, I mean, you get this blue curve here. And that's because every measurement is a noisy measurement. So what you do when you do a measurement, you add uncertainty to a signal. So what you actually record, I mean, this is the blue signal here, is actually going to be, I mean, slightly different than the input signal. So this is your measurement signal y of t, which is a function, of course, of your input signal that you like to measure. And then there is an impact of noise, which is n of t. And then what you would like to do is actually you would like to do an estimation. I mean, basically, given this measurement, you would like to estimate the input x to come as closely as possible to your original input. But there will always be a certain amount of uncertainty when doing this type of a measurement. And what you would like to do is actually you would like to reduce this uncertainty such that you come as close as possible to the red curve, which is your, let's say, I mean, the signal you would like to measure. And this is actually like where the state space modeling comes into account, extended Kalman filtering. I mean, and especially this is valid for a dual comb spectroscopy, where you, for example, you have two lasers or two combs that are beating, and you would actually like to have these combs not to be locked, because then you can do all the processing in the DSP by actually extracting this phase noise components. And in order to do that, I mean, basically what we do here is actually we have our comb under test, and here there's a local oscillator comb, and then we actually beat them on the photodiode, which is a balanced receiver here. We do analog to digital conversion, and then we have a machine learning framework actually to extract the phase noise components and to separate them. And then from these phase noise components, we build the correlation matrices, and then actually all the information about the noise is actually contained in those correlation matrices. So once you do this singular value decomposition of your correlation matrices, you have access to all the micro properties of the noise of your frequency comb. And this is basically, I mean, very similar to a dual comb spectroscopy, where you all multi-heterodyne detection, where you beat your comb under test with the LO comb, and then you do all the information extraction in the digital signal processing. And actually, this is the topic I will be discussing today. But then, for the inverse system design, I mean, this is, I mean, a little bit of an overview how it works. So basically, we have the problem statement is that we have some inputs X to our physical system, and this is Y, which is our output. And then we would actually like to have our Y to be equal to some kind of a target output of the system. And typically, you can do this optimization using a gradient descent. But in many cases, for example, if this is an experiment, I mean, you cannot actually compute the gradients through your system. Or in many cases, if the system is very complicated, then it's very difficult to compute the gradients. Then what you can actually do is actually you can trail a neural network that actually approximates or tries to learn the relationship between the output and the input. So what you do actually, you vary X, and then you actually record Y. And once you've done this, I mean, then you actually build a neural network actually that maps the output to the input. So you actually learn this inverse mapping. And then basically once you've done with the learning, you just present your target to your neural network, and then you'll immediately get the parameters X that result to this value of T. I mean, there are some here, I mean, disclaimers which I would say, well, I mean, you need to just be careful that you don't have many-to-one mappings, because if you have many-to-one mappings, I mean, then you can, it becomes very difficult to use this approach. But this is a general idea behind using the machine learning for this inverse system design. What you can also do, actually, you can also learn the forward model. So you can train the neural network to learn the forward mapping between the X and Y. So the most expensive thing in this part is actually to generate the data. But once you generate the data, then you can do this data-driven model. And then you can actually combine this into the final optimization, where you actually use this neural network that has learned inverse mapping. So you present the target output of your system, and then you get the input parameters, and then you actually propagate these input parameters to this forward network to get the target values. And if these target values are very close or not so close to the objective target values, then you can actually do some kind of fine optimization, because I mean, since this is, the neural network is just concatenation of a linear and nonlinear operations, you can take the derivative to this. And then in this way, you can do some fine optimization. And you've actually used this approach to design the Raman amplifiers, because in the Raman amplifiers, you have a pumps, and you need to adjust the pumps wavelengths and the power to obtain certain spectra. And it's a multi-dimensional optimization problem that actually where this type of approach works very well. Okay, and then something else what we are looking into is how to control nonlinear processes through phase locking. And the idea is actually that if this is a nonlinear medium here, and you have an amplifier here, and then in this case, let's say you have 3 lines here with random power. But you know that your nonlinear effects are actually dependent on the phase relationship between your lines. So what you like to actually do is you would like to have some kind of a phase control to control the phase of these lines, such that you actually redistribute the power, such that you actually obtain a flat spectra after this nonlinear mixing that is happening in the waveguide. And this is just a simulation here where we try to actually, vary the power of the input, and then we'll say, okay, we would like to have a comb by the output that has 5 equal lines at the output. And I mean, from the first principle, it seems that it's working. But because basically by controlling the phase, I mean, the nonlinear processes are very much dependent on the phase. You can actually control how the power is distributed. So even though if you come on an input, your nonlinear waveguide, there's something that has not equal power. I mean, you can, by performing a phase matching condition, you can actually match the phases such that you actually obtain this flat spectra at the output. This is still under idealized conditions where we have no phase noise or anything. So this is just, I mean, the most of the problem was actually how to design this phase control and how to compute these gradients to do this control. But this, it shows actually how, you know, you can use machine learning for some kind of optimization that you could not do before. Because, I mean, in order to do this, you know, analytically, I mean, you will need to solve these couple nonlinear Schrödinger equations and try to find the phases that give you these phase matching conditions and so on. In this case, I mean, you just let the, you know, the algorithm do this for you. So that's the convenient part of it. Okay. And for the communication part, so basically if you look at the traditional communication systems, I mean, you have some bits that you like to transmit. So typically you would translate them to symbols, and you would do some pulse shaping. You have digital to analog converter, and then you transmit them to the fiber. And at the receiver, you convert from analog to digital. I mean, then you do pulse shaping, equalization, then you recover the bits. But the idea behind this machine learning approach is actually, well, I mean, since this neural network is a universal function approximator, we can actually let it learn both the mapping and the pulse shaping. And the same things with the receiver. I mean, it's, you know, you can have this deep neural network that can, you know, combine all these things in one. And then basically it doesn't matter what kind of channel you have here. You just train this neural network by adjusting the weights, by sending the data and recovering the data, and trying to minimize the error between the input and output. So this is a very convenient approach of saying, okay, let's say I'm in transmission channel agnostic. I mean, I just, you know, I can design this system to communicate over any channel. I mean, that's the big picture. Of course, there are some challenges here, but that's the big idea, that you can actually replace many of these traditional blocks with more flexible blocks where you can actually adaptively learn your strategy to communicate over different channels. But today what I'm going to discuss is actually how to use, I mean, signal processing or machine learning methods for characterize frequency combs using a subspace tracking. And basically, I mean, this is something that we recently started working on. And I mean, if you are more interested, I mean, these are some of the papers that are either under, that we have submitted or have been published. But in general, I mean, I will look more into the details about this topic. So phase noise characterization of frequency combs is much more different compared to characterization of the lasers. And the reason is, I mean, that, for example, when you have a laser, you have a single line. While, for example, when you have a frequency comb, you have multiple lines. So one thing is actually that you have this, first of all, you have in a frequency comb, you can have more sources of of noise. And then you also have the scaling of phase noise as a function of comb line number. So that's what makes it very challenging. And then different parts of spectra will have different noise properties. And I mean, when you look at the traditional methods of characterizing phase noise, I mean, typically what you would do, actually, you would characterize the phase noise around a single line, which is, I mean, perfectly fine for a laser. But for example, if you have a comb, and especially if you have a very, you know, closely spaced comb of like 100 megahertz, then this is very difficult to do because you will need to then filter out each of the lines to do the phase noise measurement. And if you do this phase noise measurement, you will just get the total phase noise of each of the lines. I mean, you will have no idea about, you know, how different noise sources, I mean, actually contribute to this. So the question is, I mean, can we identify and measure, I mean, different noise sources, I mean, that contribute to the total phase noise of each of the lines? And this corresponds to something like a blind source separation. I mean, and so why is this, I mean, now this topic becoming important? Well, first of all, I mean, we have these real-time sampling scopes with bandwidth that exceed 100 gigahertz. So basically, I mean, if you do this dual comb detection or multi-heterodyne detection, we can detect 1,000 lines within the bandwidth of 100 gigahertz. So all of a sudden, you have access to many, many lines. And I mean, once you have access to this, I mean, you have this diversity in terms of the lines, I mean, you can use very advanced signal processing technique to extract the desired information. And this is actually an important topic because, I mean, there is not so much work done on noise characterization, especially of nonlinear processes. And for example, I mean, the reason why we started looking into this is because we were approached by different groups and said, well, I mean, here we have our frequency comb. I mean, we send it to our silicon nitride waveguide to do the spectral broadening, but all of a sudden, I mean, we like to, I mean, something happens with the spectra with the noise properties. And I mean, they really wanted to understand, I mean, what's going on, I mean, as you actually take the comb and then you send it to this type of waveguide to do this spectral broadening, like a supercontinuum generation. How does the noise scale? I mean, because they notice, okay, if this is our original spectrum, I mean, then after broadening, I mean, and you measure by line, you have a lot of noise that is accumulating. So this is something that, for example, that it's very important to understand. I mean, how does the nonlinear transformation contributes to the overall phase noise of the frequency comb once it has been broadened? And that was the reason last year I spent 1 month in Boulder working with Scott Diddons, basically because they have a system for the astro combs, where they have this resonant EO comb, and then they do some compression of the pulses, and then they actually broaden the comb. But what happens after the broadening is actually that the comb, I mean, it accumulates a lot of noise. So what we're trying to understand is actually, first of all, the noise properties of those comb, and then how does this supercontinuum generation contribute to the evolution of the phase noise. Well, I can tell you that we were very ambitious. I mean, then I had a student actually visiting Scott. So the only thing what we have managed actually is to characterize the frequency comb. I mean, and that was quite a big job. I mean, how to do this proper characterization. So the next thing is actually to characterize the supercontinuum generation. But it's not so trivial task. I mean, to characterize this type of processes. And the reason why this is relevant is because if you look at this, for example, Kerr microresonant combs, I mean, they're driven by pulses. I mean, and then you start with a comb that has certain noise properties, and then once it enters this, I mean, supercontinuum generation, this ring resonator, noise gets transformed. And you will actually like to measure, I mean, how is the noise transformed in this case? I mean, can you separate the noise sources that actually originate from the supercontinuum generation? Because it turns out that a supercontinuum generation can be a very noisy process. I mean, depending on the material properties and the dispersion and all these things. So you will actually like to design waveguides such that you minimize the noise sources. Well, I mean, and then I was wondering, I mean, is there any work on this? I mean, how does the nonlinearity affect the noise? And it turns out, I mean, there has been some work from the group in Hanover. I mean, I was really surprised that this article was not cited more times. I think it has only 2 citations, but it's a very insightful actually paper, because I mean, the title is very relevant. How accurate is optical second harmonic generation? Because we are using many times the second harmonic generation to generate the sources, but how much noise does come from the second harmonic generation? And for the lasers, I mean, there is some kind of, there are some measurements on this residual phase noise measurements. But I think for combs, I mean, if you have a comb into a material and then you do second harmonic generation, I mean, then it becomes much more difficult. So I think, I mean, it's still relevant actually to determine, I mean, how much does the nonlinear processes contribute to the noise generation? I mean, how accurate are these nonlinear processes? And this is also very relevant because every time you want to lock a comb, I mean, you are using a second harmonic generation to generate, the higher frequencies that you're using for the locking. Okay, so now I'll go a little bit more into the depth. So if you look at the commonly assumed the phase noise model of the nth line. So if you assume now a comb, and then, okay, maybe I can just also use a blackboard because I just need the chalk. Okay, it's here. So I mean, if this is our comb here, and so this is frequency, and then we have different lines here. So if you look, for example, at mth line or any line, I mean, then basically what we usually assume is that there will be 2 noise sources associated with each of the line. I mean, there will be assumed a common mode phase noise that will be common to all the modes, and then we will have a noise source actually which is associated with a repetition rate fluctuation that scales with the number of comb lines. So basically this means that there will be a term that is constant, and then there will be one term that increases linearly in terms of phase noise. But then actually if you look at some of the old papers from Pascotta and from Benkler, I mean, it turns out actually that this model is a very simplistic model of the phase noise properties of a comb. And actually this paper, again, I mean, it was very useful paper, but with very few citations. But everything you need to know about noise and combs is in that paper. It's not very easy to read this paper, but it's really, well written. Because basically what they claim, I mean, at least in this paper, is, okay, you will have a common mode term that is common to all the lines. And then you will have the fluctuation of the repetition rate. But you will also have other phase noise terms, which will come from the either transformation of your pump or from the environmental fluctuations or fluctuations from the cavity and so on. So that means that this standard model needs to be expanded into these higher order noise terms. And I mean, I've taken this and then expanded it. So basically, I mean, okay, we have a common mode, we have the repetition rate noise, but then we also may have some other noise terms that they actually add to the total phase noise of your comb line. But the thing is, I mean, we don't have any functional that actually describes how they're related to the comb number, or I mean, what kind of relationship they have. So that's why, I mean, typically I just group them here in phi x of m of t. So basically, I mean, the idea is then, I mean, try to identify, I mean, all these noise terms and how they actually scale with different comb line numbers. So that's the idea behind this, phase noise source separation, that you try to actually identify each of the noise sources and actually measure them separately. Because this will actually give you an idea of how accurate your comb is. And I mean, if you look at this in this diagram, well, it means that, for example, if you have a frequency comb and if you do a phase noise measurement, typically when you do this phase noise measurement, you just record a signal trace. But this signal trace is, I mean, if your comb has 3 noise sources, I mean, they will all combine into this phase noise trace. So what you basically do, I mean, you just make a measurement of your phase noise here, but then you somehow, I mean, you cannot distinguish between actually the phase noise sources that are affecting your comb. So what you would like to do is actually to do some kind of DSP or machine learning on your measured data to actually be able to recover these sources of phase noise. So how do we do that? Okay, so all you need to do, I mean, what is very powerful about this type of measurement is that basically you can do this blind source separation by doing dual comb interferometry or a multi-heterodyne detection. So basically what you do is you have the comb under test that you can either beat with the local oscillator comb or with a single CW laser. Now it depends a lot on the mode spacing in your comb, because what you would like to do is actually that the down-converted term actually falls within the bandwidth of your analog to digital converter such that you can actually detect all these lines. And if you write this up, I mean, if you look at the output after the analog to digital converter, I mean, basically you have another comb in electrical domain. And I mean, this comb, I mean, can be written as here. And usually, I mean, since the data is sampled, so that's why I have it not as a function of time, but as a function of this discrete time index k. And basically, if you detect your data, I mean, this is the index, I mean, on how many samples you have. So you will have, I mean, comb lines, and then within each of the down-converted comb line, you will have phase, which will be a function of k, which is basically, it's like a time series that's been digitized. And then m, which represents the comb line number. And then you have noise, because every time you do a measurement, you have a contribution from the noise here. So what you would like to do is actually you would like to first, to extract the phase of each of the comb lines. So you can, so if you plot this, you in electrical domain, you will have m comb lines. So let's say, I mean, you do this down conversion, you have 100 lines. So the first thing you do, actually, you do some kind of bandpass filtering around each of the comb line, and then you extract the phase. And then you actually assume that, okay, so what I've done, so I have a comb here, and in each of these combs, it has some phase noise. And this is the total phase noise I measure here, which I call f of m. And then I have m of those lines, but then I assume, okay, there is a matrix that actually relates some of these independent noise sources that actually contribute to the total phase noise of each of the comb lines. And this can be, common mode noise or repetition rate or some higher order noise terms. So assume actually that your measured phase noise is actually a product between the generation matrix, which you call H, and then this original phase noise sources. So in a matrix form, basically you say, okay, my measured phase noise is a multiplication of matrix H, which has dimensions of m times p, where m is the number of comb lines I have actually measured and extracted, and p is the number of phase noise sources. And then they're related, linearly, like this. And basically, these are the independent phase noise sources. So the easiest actually thing is actually to assume, if you look at the electro-optic comb, because for an electro-optic comb, basically the phase noise of each of the M line will be governed by the phase noise of the continuous wave laser and the RF you're used to drive the phase noise. And the nice thing about the electro-optic comb is basically you have only two sources of phase noise. And then if you detect M lines, then basically you have this relationship between the phase noise of the CW and the RF. So they're basically related with this very simple generation matrix H. So this is, for a very simple comb, but if you have a more, more complex, combs, then this model becomes more complicated. And then basically what you like to do is actually you will like to recover these original or independent noise sources. So you take your detected phase noise lines and then you actually multiply it with this matrix G, which is the recovery matrix, and then you will have the original phase noise sources. So, it all goes down into this matrix multiplication. So what you need to find is this matrix G that actually projects your phase noise sources to a lower dimensional space. So that's why it's called subspace tracking. You're looking for the subspace. So even though you detect, let's say, 20 lines and you have measured 20 phase noise traces, it means that if your original phase noise sources are only 2, then you can actually only use 2 phase noise sources to describe all the 20 phase noise sources. So you're looking for some kind of it's very similar to the principal component analysis. You're looking for the main orthogonal vectors, then they can describe the rest of your space. Okay, so what you cannot do actually is you cannot recover the sources if they add linearly. So that's the limitation of the method. If this is the measured phase noise of your mth line, and if you have, for example, let's say n noise sources that add to the same common mode, then you can actually not differentiate them, and you can prove this mathematically. So how do we actually find those matrices? So basically, so what we're assuming is that if we don't know how the phase noise sources are generated in the comb. So what we do actually, okay, we have done the dual cone spectroscopy, we have extracted M phase noise sources, then we know, okay, there is some kind of a matrix, which we call here G transpose, that actually maps, let's say, this M dimensional vector to a P dimensional vector, where P is number of independent noise sources, which is much less than M. And then in order to formulate this as an optimization problem, then you say, okay, there is another matrix G, which is the transpose of this one, that gives us back to the original subspace. And then you actually try to minimize this reconstruction error. So if you're familiar with machine learning, this is a typical linear autoencoder structure. And it turns out actually that the solution to this optimization problem is obtained when this reconstruction matrix is equal to this matrix QP, which is, the matrix associated with the P eigenvalues of the covariance matrix. So all your information about the phase noise is actually contained in the covariance matrix of your phase noise signals. And you can recover those independent phase noise sources by doing this, simple, matrix multiplication. You take the QP matrix, which controls P eigenvectors, because you only have P sources of noise, independent sources of noise, and then you do this projection here. And then you need to do some diagonalization here. But in any case, if you do some algebra here, you can see actually that your phase covariance matrix, you can write it in this form here, where you have the Q matrix times the lambda matrix, which contains the eigenvalues, and then Q transpose. And it turns out actually that the matrix containing the eigenvalues will contain the eigenvalues that correspond to the noise sources. So if you do this eigenvalue decomposition of your covariant matrix, you will have P non-zero eigenvalues which correspond to the the number of noise sources of your comb. Okay. So what is important is actually how to estimate this covariance matrix. And I mean, as you can see here, I mean, this estimation is very much dependent on the signal to noise ratio. So if this is, I mean, this is a simulation here. So if you vary the signal to noise ratio from 10 dB to 20 dB, you see that using the conventional method where you actually don't, you don't take any special care about the measurement noise, you can reproduce this covariance matrix. And you see, I mean, this is the root mean square error of the estimation. I mean, for the conventional method, as long as you have high signal to noise ratio, you are fine. But the problem becomes when your signal to noise ratio is low. And that's where you actually need to use some machine learning techniques, like Bayesian filtering, I mean, to estimate the phase to construct this, to reconstruct the correlation matrix. And depending on, I mean, how accurately you actually construct this covariance matrix, I mean, this will affect the rest of your analysis. So, I mean, this means that, it's very important to have a high power comb that you actually get enough signal to noise ratio. So if we want to do some joint experiments, I think, the most important parameter to optimize is the signal to noise ratio. You need to be able to have enough signal to noise ratio to actually do the proper estimation. I mean, to have very low variance of your estimation error. Okay, then we went to the lab. Basically, first we did a very simple numerical simulation. So this was our electro-optic comb. We have a local oscillator here, and then we emulate the EO comb by having a signal and a simple phase modulator. We have a balanced photo detection, and then this is the spectra after the A to D converter. We actually filter each of the lines, we extract the phase, and then we do the substrate tracking to estimate the eigenvectors, eigenvalues of the covariance matrix. And the good thing about EO comb is actually you have a very simple relationship between the phase noise of your signal and the LO and the RF. So, I mean, this is a very good test example, I mean, to benchmark your results. And it turns out actually there is a very nice physical interpretation, I mean, if you take this correlation matrix, I mean, to the eigenvectors and to the eigenvalues. So if you plot all the eigenvectors of the correlation matrix, you see, I mean, that the first eigenvector actually corresponds to it's basically flat. So what it tells you actually is that the first source of phase is contributing equally to all the comb lines. Because the eigenvector will tell you, I mean, how do the different sources of phase noise contribute to the noise of different lines. And the first source of noise will actually contribute equally to each of the lines, I mean, which actually corresponds to the common mode noise. And I mean, if you remember it, I mean, we have that FF equals F common mode plus M times FRF. So I mean, so you have the common mode term, and then of course, I mean, the second eigenvector, it decreases linearly as a function of comb line number. And this is exactly what is shown here, that that your repetition rate, I mean, it will contribute linearly to each of your comb lines. And if you look at the eigenvalues, I mean, basically then each of the you only have two eigenvalues, because I mean, for an EO comb, you only have two sources of phase noise, so you will only have two distinct eigenvalues that increase with time, while the rest of the eigenvalues is very close to zero. So it tells you actually that your system is dominated by two sources of noise. And then actually then we went to then we tried to say, okay, if you take this and then actually try to recover the first source of noise, I mean, then you get this line, I mean, then it overlaps really well with the reference. And also the second source also overlaps very well with the RF noise, which is, I mean, as expected. So, I mean, the simulations show that, okay, this measurement method works. I mean, you can actually separate the noise sources and actually you can measure them. And then, at least the measure phase noise sources are in accordance with what you would expect. Okay, then we went to the lab and we built an EO comb, and I think the results are very similar. So, I mean, we obtained, these are the eigenvectors. So the first eigenvector is flat, the second is increasing linearly, and then we obtained also two eigenvalues. So nothing surprising there. So, then we went actually and measured the mode log laser. So this was the FM mode log laser, where the dynamics of the laser are not so well described using analytical methods. And there it becomes much more tricky to characterize the noise. And I mean, what we did there, because the spacing of the mode lock laser was 60 gigahertz, then we actually had another comb, which was another mode lock laser, and then we actually beat them in a photodiode. I mean, we detected the data, I mean, sampled the data, pass it through the bandpass filter to extract the phase noise of each of the comb lines, and then we actually pass it to the subspace tracking method to estimate the eigenvectors and the eigenvalues. And what we observe here is actually, I mean, very interesting behavior. And the first thing was actually that this standard phase noise model breaks down. Because what we observed actually is that when we look at the variance, I mean, when we plotted all the eigenvalues, we saw there are actually 3 eigenvalues. And that means that, that you go a little bit beyond this standard phase noise model, which tells you, oh, for each of the, for a comb, you only have 2 phase noise sources. So this shows that actually that you have 3 non-zero eigenvalues. That means that there is some kind of an extra term that it's adding to your comb. And when we look at the eigenvectors, I mean, we see that there is a first eigenvector that is a constant as a function of comb line number. That means that you have a common mode, so you have one source of phase noise that contributes equally to all of the modes. And then you have the second one, which actually contributes linearly, but then you have this third one, which is a bit, jingling around. And when you actually do the projection into the power spectrum density, you see that you have 3 power spectrum density. This is the common mode noise, repetition rate noise, and then you have this, what we call the residual phase noise term. So, I mean, the good thing is that we were able to measure that, okay, you go beyond this standard phase noise model, but we were actually not able to explain, I mean, where does this come from? Is this just a measurement error, or is it really something, physically happening in the laser? And the PhD student left. I mean, then we actually, decided, okay, we need to move on. We actually never understood whether, where does this third component come in this semiconductor mode lock laser? Whether it's something, perturbation of the cavity, or what is there? So the measurement techniques is good to identify the noise sources, but it doesn't give you so much insight into the physics. And that's why you need to have a very detailed simulation model, which we did afterwards. Okay. And then, when people realized that what you could do with this measurement technique, then we were contacted with the IPG photonics, and they were very much interested in characterization of the chromium zinc frequency combs. So basically, I don't know the details about this frequency comb, but it's at 1 micron. I think, you have some 2 microns, yes.
2.4, right?
Yeah. So they have this parametric oscillator here, the parametric amplifier, and then, they have a very broadband comb, and then what we do actually, we do some second harmonic generation here and then we beat it with this laser at 1.064 nanometers. And then basically, these are the comb lines here, and then what we do is actually we do, all the processing, the similar what we did before, and then try to actually characterize the phase noise properties of this comb. And this was actually not a locked frequency comb. So, we were really trying to investigate what is the stability of this type of a comb. And it turns out, that their comb is really good because, when we plotted the eigenvalues, we could clearly observe that there is only one eigenvalue that is different than 0, which means that there is only one source of phase noise within the measurement range. And then when we plotted the eigenvectors, then we only got one. You see all these random vectors, here, it doesn't show you anything. There is no structure in them. But there is, the first eigenvector is flat, means that there is, it shows that there is one phase noise component that contributes to the all lines. And then when we project it to find the original phase noise source, this is the power spectrum density. And this is the power spectrum density of the common mode. While all the other modes are actually below the measurement noise floor. So this actually, measurement showed actually that the comb is pretty good and pretty stable because it was an unlocked comb. And there was, the repetition rate phase noise was so low that you could not even measure it. So we could say that, the repetition rate phase noise is below minus 120 dB. And we actually analyzed, more than 2,000 lines of the comb. So, it is over the very broad spectral range that you get such a very good noise performance. Because basically, we took, can I go back now? We took all these lines and actually we processed all the lines. Because even though you had like I don't know how many lines you have here, but basically, they just show you, that all those lines are dominated with one phase noise source. And that's actually, I think, quite a nice thing about their comb. So I mean, we submitted this to optics letter, so it's still under revision. But I mean, we put it on the archive where we have all the details about the experiment. But it just that demonstrates, okay, that you by doing this type of a measurement technique, you can get a more complete picture of your noise properties of your comb compared to doing a traditional measurement. Okay, and then we actually went, when I was in Boulder, I mean, we were very much interested in those resonant EO combs. And the resonant EO combs, I mean, they are much more difficult to describe. I mean, they're a little bit different compared to the regular EO combs, because here you have a cavity, and then you have a phase modulator within the cavity. So you have a seed laser here, which has a certain noise, and then phase noise, and then you have also an RF generator with a phase noise here. And then, there is some kind of a transformation in the cavity, because what we were actually puzzled about is that, typically, I mean, this resonant comb has a resonances, and they were expecting to have the filtering at the resonances of high frequency components of the phase noise. But they were not observing these filtering effects. And, from the phase noise measurement, I mean, they couldn't get any idea what was going on. Then we think, okay, I think the reason is that the standard model actually breaks down. So originally, I mean, they thought, okay, if I have a resonant EO comb, I will have a contribution from the CW, and I will also have the contribution of the phase noise from the RF. But we think that actually there is something happening in the cavity, and the cavity is somehow transforming the input phase noise and the RF phase noise, and actually contributing to the other phase noise components. And this is actually exactly where the subspace tracking comes into a play, because you can actually separate the sources of phase noise. So the first thing actually what we did, so you're trying to actually identify, I mean, these extra terms here, because we were thinking actually that they are hindering the filtering. So we built a model, I mean, the simulation model. So because, I mean, all these things with noise, I mean, if you don't have a simulation model, it becomes very tricky to interpret the results. And then, I mean, we plotted the frequency noise. So, I mean, this is the theory. I mean, this is the CW. And these are the, I mean, extracted phase noise of line 0, -2, and -4. And as expected, I mean, this will increase. But then we actually, when we did the phase noise decomposition, what we observe here, oh, okay, there is a contribution from the CW. There is a first phase noise component. There is a second phase noise component that comes from the RF. But then there is also this third phase noise component. And this is related to how you are optimizing your cavity. And it turns out actually that you will have a common mode noise, and you will have basically, I mean, repetition rate phase noise that are associated with RF. But then you will also have a phase noise actually that evolves around each of the lines, which is the third component. Which again means that your standard phase noise model breaks down because you have more than 2 phase noise components. And then actually we did a measurement, and actually we obtained very similar results, that that apart from the CW contribution, I mean, you also have this third component here that contributes to the overall phase noise. And basically it turns out that, that the beta, I mean, which is the modulation factor of your comb. So as you increase the beta, I mean, you actually get broader and broader combs. So as you increase the beta here, the third component increases as well. And that's the reason why you can actually not see this filtering. So there is actually a trade-off between how broad comb you want and how much phase noise your comb will have. And this is also shown here, that the frequency of this third component increases as you increase your modulation index. So this is a very good example of how actually you can use this measurement method to design the cavity and to use this to suppress the noise, because you cannot have a very broadband cavity in this case and at the same time have very low noise performance. And basically, I mean, this brings me to the end of my talk, and I think what I've shown is that in identification, the composition of phase noise sources is of great importance, because basically when you do a measurement, I mean, sometimes, I mean, you will go beyond this standard phase noise model. And it's very important actually to identify when you go above this, because, I mean, this will give you an opportunity also to minimize the noise sources. And I mean, there are many different methods that exist. I mean, currently, I mean, the method what we're using is very simple. I mean, and the problem is that we are limited by the measurement noise. So, I mean, if we can actually somehow, suppress the measurement noise, that will be the next step. But in general, I mean, the method is very useful for combs which dynamics are, I mean, less understood or very difficult to describe. especially if you have this transformation of phase noise, I mean, from your pumps and the CW. And I mean, the next question is, I mean, can we actually use this information to suppress some of the noise sources and even to obtain, I mean, better frequency combs? And that's all with me, I think.